the traditional custodians of the land, seas and waterways on which we are meeting today, we pay our respects to elders, past, present and emerging. We also acknowledge that we are on stolen land upon which sovereignty has not been ceded. Welcome, my name's Joey. I'm a community activist and a midwife. We've got 4 great speakers lined up for you tonight. Just some housekeeping. We're selling drinks at the back to raise money for Cancer for Refugees project, which is supplying refugees in Port Moresby with mobile credit. Please dig deep. One of the big inspirations for me was how red Peter Dutton would turn if he knew what we were donating for, because he doesn't like refugees with mobiles. We'll start with Amin, who's joining us from Brisbane. Amin is currently in detention at the Kangaroo Point hotel. So over to you, Amin.
He's muted.
Hi, everyone. First, let me thank you one by one for the support that we are getting every single day from you guys and other organizations and groups that they are supporting us since 2013 until now. I actually appreciate what you guys are doing for us, and it's mean a lot for us. Firstly, I just want to mention that, until 2 days ago, I was in Kangaroo Point and now in BITA. 2 days ago, they brought me by force with handcuffs. They confiscate my phone, which is they are not allowed to do that. I don't know with what kind of law they have done this to me. And they brought me in here. And now this is 2 days I have been sleeping outside the building because I don't have a room, because for my medical condition, I do need to have a single room, which is I did had when I was in Kangaroo Point. And now they are, they don't want to give me a single room, and actually I don't have any other way rather than sleeping outside, which is, it's unsafe because yesterday they captured a snake, and 2 days ago they captured a snake outside. So about other thing that how we can actually change the policy and to put a more pressure to the government to get our freedom. I do believe there is a couple of things that we need to do. First of all, I just want to mention about today, there is 10 people from Nauru, but not from Medivac. They have been released. And I do believe that is a kind of trick for the people from the government to show the people that they are started to releasing people. But the reality, they are doing that to change people's mind so they cannot protest. They stop the protest and they stop the powerful support because the Christmas is very close and they don't want any protests and all these kind of things will happen. So that's why they release these people to show the protesters that they are started to releasing people. But I do believe that that is just a plan and they don't want to release any more people. There are just 10 people, which is they are not here by the Medivac legislation. And they are not trying to get anyone out or release anyone until probably next year or release anyone in here. And about how we can put the maximum pressure to the government to see a positive sign from them. I do believe that we can do something in social medias. It's powerful in a way, but I do believe it's not enough. we need to have a action in a person, not just a social media. We need a huge protest and a very organized and the kind of very organized, and we need to fix the broken communication that we have between us, the groups and advocates with the organizations, to actually have a complete perfect contact with them. So whatever we want to do, I mean the protesters outside and supporters, whenever they want to do something in Brisbane, for example, that should happen in all over Australia, not just in Brisbane, in the same time. So to put the maximum pressure to the government, like protests or whatever it's possible to do, it should be everyone, not a kind of separate. See a couple of organizations, groups that they are working separately, and that is not enough, and that is not gonna change anything. We need to be completely united, so to put the maximum pressure from everywhere. Thank you.
You're muted, Joey.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Amin. That was really great to hear from you and how we can all work together in solidarity to achieve change.
Thank you.
Sorry, we're just having some more technical issues up here. Our next speaker is Caroline Da Costa. Caroline has extensive experience of providing reproductive healthcare for refugee and asylum seeker women and of the Canadian Refugee Sponsorship Program.
Thank you very much for asking me along here. I feel very humbled to be following you, Amin, as a person who is in detention and strongly motivated to continue doing what we can to release everybody who is in detention across Australia at the earliest possible date. I made a few notes, and I do think that I thought about my own motivation in what I have tried to do to assist with refugees and asylum seekers over the past few years. When I was 19, I was living in Jerusalem, which was then in Jordan. I had left Australia. I hadn't started medicine. It was 1966, 67. And I worked in Jerusalem. It was part of Jordan at that time. And I worked in a restaurant. I was paid, and I also volunteered in a refugee camp in Ramallah. The people there had been there for 20 years, since the events of 1948, when they were pushed out of Palestine. So I saw that, and then I was there at the end of May 1967, when it was clear the Israelis were going to come further into Jordan. And people were fleeing. I saw people fleeing with their families, in cars, in carts, with goats, with horses, on bikes, on foot, with their children. And I had a British passport because I was Australian, and I was told to leave, and I was evacuated. None of the people who were fleeing from their homes were able to do that. I was able to go to Ireland, do medicine, and come back eventually to Australia. And I was, for many years, I felt guilt about this. And what had happened to the Palestinian people that I'd seen, most of whom did not go back home and who are in a diaspora now throughout the world. In the 1990s, I was practicing medicine in Sydney, and with mandatory detention and the various barriers that were being provided to asylum seekers, I was asked to care for women. I was by then a gynecologist, an obstetrician, care for women who were not able to access Medicare. And obviously this was pro bono, and I began to realise the extent of the problem. And I realised that while individually doctors could contribute to asylum seeker healthcare, we could also band together asylum seekers. I was asked to start to provide pressure to change things, particularly after the Tampa incident. And I think if we continue to do this, we have succeeded in making some changes. We banded together and said, too bad if we talk about what we have seen on Nauru. I did work on Nauru just for a week. Jonathan Strauss was working for much longer. I went there just for a week to perform surgery. 2003, was told to sign a document that I wouldn't say a word, came back and spoke immediately to the bulletin. I have continued to provide reports about women who needed to be transferred. And in 2017, I met a very remarkable woman known to some people here, Dima Habu, who was transferred for the birth of her son, Mohammed. And her husband was left behind. So she spent, I think that the Home Affairs Department thought they were going to send her straight back to Nauru, but there was intervention from the National Justice Project and from many other people, and she stayed in Australia, but she was a single mother on her own for 2 years. Her husband remained on Nauru. By the time he was brought here, his name is Hani, he has been quite willing to have his situation shared with the public. The family were in Adelaide, and I had discovered the private sponsorship scheme for which Canadian immigration run. And I have a son in Canada, and although it took 18 months, and I have to say quite a lot of work and effort, and the generosity of many, many people, including many here, it was possible for this family to move to Toronto, and they went from being stateless to having Canadian residence, and in 2 years' time they'll be citizens. So what are the conclusions of all this experience? First is that my guilt was able to be somewhat subdued, and it could turn into advocacy. And I will continue to advocate because I have this experience. I haven't been a refugee, and I'm very glad that I haven't been, and I don't anticipate being one, but I am very aware of the situation of people who are forced out of their homes and seek help elsewhere, seek assistance, seek a home elsewhere. And I think it is possible on an individual level to help single refugees and families in ways that are beneficial to them. But it's absolutely essential to do this after asking them what they would like, what they want. They are all individuals themselves, and they have their own views on what should happen to them and how we should advocate. And I think that it's important to remember that. I'm also happy to help anyone who would like to be involved in Canadian sponsorship. It's detailed, it is complex, but it is worthwhile in the end. But secondly, working in a group, it is possible to make changes. We did get children out of detention. We have managed to move some people from Nauru. It's important also not to give up. And I think that doctors, as a group, can make a difference. It needs a lot more, I freely admit. The current situation is appalling, as Amin demonstrates here. We need to get rid of detention altogether, and I think that was one of the things that Jonathan suggested we would talk about this evening. We just keep on saying it has to end. So I'm going to stop now. I hope I've given you some thoughts on which to continue the conversation.
Thank you so much for that, Caroline. That was really inspirational and a very hope-filled discussion. Our next speaker is Jacinta O'Leary. Jacinta is a nurse and a midwife with experience in aeromedical retrieval, intensive care, emergency midwifery, trauma, disaster response, and Aboriginal health and refugee health. She worked on Nauru in 2017 and became a whistleblower after witnessing the erosion of human rights of refugees and asylum seekers and the subsequent impact this had on their health and well-being. Thank you, Jacinta.
Hello, I'm Jacinta O'Leary. Yes, in 2017 I worked on Nauru at the Regional Processing Centre. I didn't go to Nauru to become a whistleblower, that was not my intention, but after exhausting every avenue within that system to achieve adequate healthcare for people, it became my only option. Within a day of being on Nauru, I realised that the systems of healthcare were nowhere near Australian standards, as the government often claims. However, it took me several weeks to realise just how dysfunctional and ineffective the systems were, and that many people were actually being harmed by them. I was caring for a group of people who had medical conditions which could not be treated on Nauru. The care they needed was only accessible in Australia. However, the government blocked anyone from Nauru being transferred, even when people had severe illness and senior clinicians had recommended that immediate transfer was necessary. Being repeatedly denied transfer and being forced to live with medical conditions which were left untreated had a devastating effect on the refugees' mental health, which was already fragile after living on Nauru for 5 years. They were self-harming, causing themselves significant injury, and had plans for suicide. I was extremely worried and I took my concerns to senior management. I was told that this directive was coming from a ministerial level and that it was not going to change. I then decided, having exhausted all avenues available to me, to reach out beyond the system on Nauru and get some help. Initially, I leaked information to journalists despite signing a confidentiality agreement which threatened me with 2 years jail if I spoke to the media. Some articles were written which raised some awareness about the situation, but the policy didn't change. I then reached out to human rights lawyers. The lawyers took the case to the Federal Court of Australia and they won. The Australian government was ordered to transfer these refugees to Australia for the medical care they needed. I'm forever grateful to these lawyers who realised the urgency of this case. Without this timely legal action, I'm certain that there would have been more deaths on Nauru. The system of offshore detention has been repeatedly criticised over many years by well-respected organisations, including the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, the World Health Organisation, Amnesty International, the Australian Medical Association, the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners, the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists, and the Royal Australian College of Physicians. This is not a complete list. In February of this year, Australia's systems of offshore detention drew the attention of the prosecutor for the International Criminal Court. He described the living conditions on Manus and Nauru as unhygienic, overcrowded tents or other primitive structures. People suffered heat stroke resulting from lack of shelter from the sun and stifling heat. There was limited access to healthcare, and the environment was rife with sporadic acts of physical and sexual violence committed by staff at the facilities and members of the local population. These conditions caused severe mental suffering, including anxiety and depression, that led many, including children, to engage in acts of suicide, attempted suicide, and other forms of self-harm, without adequate mental health care provided to assist or alleviate their suffering. The prosecutor goes on to say, these conditions of detention appear to have constituted cruel, inhumane or degrading treatment, which appears to have been in violation of the fundamental rules of international law. But the International Criminal Court has stopped short of deciding to prosecute the Australian government, saying that while the imprisonment of refugees and asylum seekers form the basis of a crime against humanity, the violations did not rise to the level to warrant further investigation. What I didn't understand was, given the body of evidence that now exists about the cruel and inhumane treatment of refugees and asylum seekers, why was this system allowed to continue? Australia is a signatory to several international treaties, including the Declaration of Human Rights and the Refugee Convention. Despite promising to uphold these treaties, the government's treatment of refugees and asylum and people seeking asylum is not in line with these international treaties at all. Why was this system not considered unlawful and shut down? What I have learned is that even though the government has committed to these international treaties and promised to uphold them, these treaties do not automatically become part of Australia's domestic law. I have learned that under international human rights law, there is generally no way of compelling a government to comply with international obligations. Furthermore, Australian domestic law does not comprehensively protect those international human rights. So what do we do about this? For some years now, there's been a push for a national charter of rights, which would be a way for those international obligations to be set out in Australian domestic law. Australia is the only Western democracy that does not have a Bill of Rights or a Charter of Rights, which is a list of all the human rights the nation thinks are important and deserving of legal protection. Already Victoria, the ACT and Queensland have charters of rights in their state parliaments. And what this means is that these governments are required to consider and act compatibly with human rights when laws and policies are being developed. It puts human rights at the core of decision making. It also means that if a government's law or policy breaches human rights, then people have the power to take action in court. If we had a national charter of rights in the federal parliament, it would help with stopping the cruel, inhumane and degrading treatment in detention, both offshore and onshore. It would allow access to proper medical treatment in detention. It would allow access to communications in detention. It would stop the government from returning people to risks of harm. It would ensure refugee claims are processed fairly, and it would help to stop the detention of children. There are different models that a charter could take, but I'm not going to try to explain those because this is not my area of expertise. There is a website, charterofrights.org.au, charterofrights.org.au, which has presentations from human rights lawyers who explain this with much more accuracy and detail than I could tonight. Disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer or a human rights expert. I'm just someone who has witnessed firsthand what happens when people's human rights are violated. I'm trying to make sense of what happened when I worked on Nauru, how that was allowed to happen in modern Australia, and how we can prevent this from happening again. The government has displayed for years now that it is willing to trample all over the human rights of refugees and asylum seekers, even to the point that 13 people have died and hundreds have been harmed, some permanently, including children. Sorry. They do this because it works for them politically. The LNP would have us believe that treating these people with dignity and respect would see the boats start again, despite our borders being heavily patrolled and turning boats back. Any policy that relies on cruelty and harm of human beings for its fulfilment is deeply flawed and indefensible. As a citizen of this country, I'm appalled. The people who continue to be directly affected by these current policies, who are now into their 8th year of detention, require our ongoing and direct support. Human rights should always come before politics. It's clear that our politicians cannot be trusted to do this, and the case for a national charter of rights is compelling. A charter of rights would provide a structure to uphold the values we all care about: dignity, respect, equality, compassion, and freedom. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing with us, Jacinta. I think we might just sit for a couple of seconds and just hold in the room what Jacinta said, because I think that was really, really powerful. Thank you. Okay, so our final speaker is Jonathan. Jonathan is a Social Alliance activist, National Secretary of the Rural Australians for Refugees, and a social movement researcher. He's been involved with and written for Green Left about the refugee rights movement for about 2 decades. And just a reminder to everyone, you can subscribe to Green Left. It's available online or in print. And Alex will put up a link for anyone online who's interested in subscribing. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Joey, and also for your work in organising tonight's forum. And thank you to Jacinta and to Caroline for agreeing to speak. I'd like to acknowledge we are meeting on the land's traditional owners and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Indeed, sovereignty was never ceded. And 2 or 3 months ago, I started to think what way forward is a topic that the refugee rights movement needs to get to grips with. And I thought that people here in Cairns, with our experiences and our knowledge and our understanding, had something to contribute to this discussion. And I guess with the way things are in the world today, suddenly you start thinking about projecting that a bit further than just your own local city. And I'm glad for everyone who's been able to join us on Zoom tonight as well. I don't want to say this is a unique thought because that's not. And in fact, it was interesting. Very soon after I'd started thinking, let's organise something like this discussion, another member of the National Committee for Rural Australians Refugees was saying, let's discuss exactly the same topic. And maybe not in the same words, but certainly the same topic. And we've had started some of that discussion on the National Committee, and it's really, we are hoping this will broaden out to the RA groups to discuss as well. Because it's certainly, I think, a way we need to think about it. And in fact, I think it's really a question for all of the refugee movement, all the progressive forces in this country to try to get to grips with. And I'll say this, I mean, I sort of had the feeling this was needed. In fact, in some ways, I think my colleagues on the in RA were getting more quickly to why we need this discussion. The government really has become totally intransigent on this question. And in fact, it's actually really using it as one of its main hobby horses. On top of everything else this year, we've seen the cutting of welfare payments to most temporary visa holders and the cutting of the refugee program, official refugee program, that is people arriving legally and sort of fully recognised by the Australian government, by 5,000, which is about 30% of the total program from the previous year to this year on an ongoing basis. It's really determined to only put forward the worst possible options for those who have come here by sea to seek asylum, either deprivation, as I said, withdrawing welfare payments, being sent to the US, and this is the option they had after they couldn't manage to get people sent to Cambodia. So that tells you something, I guess, about, we know something about the US, even if things might improve there slightly now. Or frankly, their other option was home, so-called, to persecution. Now, before that, in the last couple of years, I'd say that the movement was chipping away a bit at some of the egregious oppressions, egregious anti-refugee edifice that the governments over 3 decades have set up in this country. We saw the Kids Off Nauru campaign, the Medivac campaign successfully bring in that law, subsequently repealed, of course, and so on. Yes, in the last year, that law was again repealed. And then the COVID-19 pandemic has basically served as the cover to remove, as I said, nearly all the welfare support to refugees on temporary visas. Besides looking at why we need to have this discussion, certainly the other thing I think that the RA National Committee has very usefully tried to start to get its head around was what is our theory of change. And there's quite a lot to be said about that, but I'm basically going to go mainly to the positive aspects of this, if I can put it that way. In a sense, why you need a theory of change is it's easy to basically just do the first thing that's in front of you. To more consciously ask and try to answer the question, what next, is real art in politics. And in a social change movement, to know how to answer what next, as you might want to, you need to keep in mind what you're trying to change and who is making the change. I'll put those 2 questions at least. Australia is a socially divided country. You know, as socialists, we've discussed this as class-ridden, but of course we extend it beyond that as well. There's been the discussion, I guess, that we're used to now about the 1 versus the 99%, the 1% versus the 99%. And I'd hope it'd be pretty clear that the forms of racism we have in this country among the fundamental dividers and oppressions in it. In fact, it's a society that can put at the centre of a successful election campaign the statement that the former Prime Minister John Howard said, we, and who did he mean by we is a good question, but let's proceed on his words. We will decide who comes here and the manner in which they come. And that basically expressed the sort of authoritarian attitude towards refugees that you see coming from the political regime in this country. Now, I know whether or not we can win a majority for refugee rights can seem difficult, and I welcome Amin's comments about the need to try and unite our forces in protest and in the fight for refugee rights. Thank you, Amin, for those comments before. Many social movements have actually already started with majority support or very quickly gain this as they're approaching success. You get the feel that you're actually on the march, so to speak. Whereas our gains in this movement to date have been hard fought and fairly temporary. But even so, I'd say, within the arc of support from those who already agree with us, to those who listen to what we have to say as refugee rights activists, to our intractable opponents, it's the last that really are relatively few in number. And you might say, why would I say that? Well, one of the things I'd ask you to consider, if you wish, is the work of a group like Rural Australians for Refugees. And look, yes, we'd like to take it further, but it's focused primarily, I'll say this, particularly from actually, though not only to, older regional and rural Australians. Now, for those of us who come from the left, this is not exactly the population cohort we usually expect to gain support from. So you think about what that means. And yet, where its groups have been able to develop their work, I must say in Queensland, I think it's one of our weaker areas, but where it has been able to develop its work, it has had some real successes. If you want a political example, this is part of the story of why the coalition lost the Indi electorate in northeast Victoria and had a situation where progressively minded independents, Cathy McGowan, and even more so Helen Haines, have replaced them in that electorate, because there's very strong rural Australians refugee groups throughout the region, about 9 groups altogether in many of the small towns and Wodonga as well through that area. So in a sense, this is just one of the kinds of efforts to find the ways not to spend too much time talking with the intransigent, including those politicians, and to find effective ways to talk with those who listen. Some of you might have done the Words That Matter program, which certainly we've done as a training session for Cairns for Refugees. We discussed that it's values that win people over. And I think that's basically right. Although I don't want to discount the question of facts or policies, I think those are important, but in some ways those things are about how those who have decided they are committed to the cause, they want to see refugee rights upheld, how we can discuss our values. That's where facts and policy come in. But I also have to say that there are our values and their values. And when I say they, I mean the opponents of refugee rights. So, for example, we've heard this story about boat turnbacks stop deaths at sea. And I don't talk about that too much now. But that was the line that was being run for quite a few years from 2013 onwards. What they've hidden behind this exclamation of value about not wanting people to die, which I happen to agree with, is that government policy has generally refused to let people get visas if they're considered to be potentially going to claim refugee status. So country after country, you just find it very hard to get a visa. You can't arrive by air cheaply. You can only arrive by sea unauthorised. In fact, this prohibition is what has created the so-called people smuggling. Our Australian government is the cause of this so-called people smuggling. That's the truth of the matter. The problem is that values can't be tested such that it tells you how to act politically. At this level, we want to see people move into our framework of values. We want to lay security concerns and have the focus on equity and people's welfare. We need to win majorities for demands that express our values and test the actions of governments and all those in power, so people can learn about what they need to do themselves and gain confidence that they can do that. To the extent that those chipping away efforts I discussed before didn't address the social as opposed to the humanitarian, because that's what they certainly did address, values that concern the refugee rights movement in which we're founded, the potential for reversals like the ones we've seen was there. We hadn't basically won the struggle for ideas, if you like. It wasn't about creating an effective political majority. You see, we have to deal with a situation like the one Alice Walker has described. She said, the most common way people give up their power is by thinking they don't have any. So Jacinta's discussed pursuing a Charter of Rights. And I'll say as a socialist, typically, our call in its most fundamental level is for open the borders. And each of these is a very valid response to the need for refugee rights. And I'm not going to go into the question of which I might think is better. That's not so much my point here. My concern is more that actually they are somewhat problematic as a demand for the movement for refugee rights. And just excuse this moment. You need to open both doors, and they are open. So we have someone entering with a wheelchair. Anyway, these demands, like a Charter for Human Rights or to open the borders, to incorporate other values, liberal democracy's constitutionalism, or the internationalism that socialism holds out proudly as part of its banner. But we also need to be aware that people coming into our movement, generally stemming from their experiences with interactions with specific refugees or denial of specific refugee rights, won't be across such broader social change values, at least when they're just joining a movement for social change. And that impacts on the kinds of demands we want to put to the forefront for the movement. I think we need to begin looking again at demands around the themes of bring them here, let them stay. These are some old demands, but I think they are quite valuable in building the movement. And this is for those refugees now who want that, and not all, of course, want to stay in Australia given what's happened, but also into the future in terms of actually securing the the ideas, the human rights behind the refugee conventions, the kind of things that Jacinta talked about. If we have more specific demands, they need to fit into that. So when we hear that the call for the Tamil family to be able to return to Billawheeler, the Home to Billow campaign, of course, that's very much part of what I'm saying. Just a point to conclude. What I've discussed refers to refugees as them. It refers to refugees as them. That is, as if they were an other, not us. Now, the English language doesn't always work very well in this regard in terms of how to put a demand together or how to put a slogan together. But in practice, our actual practices, we want this thing of seeing and acting, and I'm not saying we always do this, but we want to make sure we do not see our refugees among us as another. In social movements, I hear a lot of talk in the last years about people acting as allies. But I have to say that in terms of the discussions I'm going through in the labour movement at the moment, after 2 decades or more in which this concept of allies has been one put forward for organising and winning sort of popular support, some of us are drawing the conclusion that we instead need to consider people, workers and others as a whole, and how they fit in relation to that divided society I discussed before. On that basis, you look for common interests among people. You look for the relations of solidarity that they can develop. And to me, this is the road to a new social power that we should take. Thank you for your time.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Jonathan. We'll now open up the floor to any questions. Online, if you can just put your hand up, Alex will then let us know that you've put your hand up and we'll then ask you to unmute your microphone. Any questions at all?
I'd like to make a comment.
Yes.
Yeah, I came to Australia in 1959. And one of the first guys I met here was a drinking mate of my brother. And he used this term, refos, you know. I'd never heard that before, you know. Refo, what's a refo? You know, and then he was talking about, refugees. And I suspect like the Liberals and the Labor Party are, going along with this anti-refugee thing because they're frightened of losing votes to Pauline Hanson. I really do believe there's a big part of that, and this anti-refugee thing is fanned by people like Alan Jones. One of the things he said was, I heard him say was, you could hide a Kalashnikov underneath a burqa. I mean, I just could, but he has an audience that soak up that stuff. And what I don't hear talked about I went to, we gave a bit of a talk up at the JCU. There was a doctor, Iraqi doctor, that had to flee Iraq, Saddam Hussein's Iraq, because he refused to cut off ear of, I think they may have been army deserters. So he went, all the sort of thing, and he paid what they call them, that guys. Sorry? Yes, he paid us. He did everything, like that. Supposed to be really, really bad to get to Australia. And he spent some time in a refugee camp. But then he set up practice, and he did this operation that fitting a false leg, and he developed that, and Caroline seems to know about that. And sorry. That's right, and so I don't hear Alan Jones talk about these people, So, there's that side. I heard him, scratch an Australian, you'll find a racist, And there is, like these talk, shock jocks that play to that stuff, and I'm just astounded. I'm glad there's meetings like that and there's people like that.
I'll just check the whether we have any questions. We don't seem to have any questions from online. And in response to that, Terry, thank you for that. I think the era of Alan Jones is hopefully coming to an end. Watch that space. Did you want to come up and ask a question?
I don't really think into the podcast. I guess for me, listening to Jonathan and what Terry actually just said, and I wonder if we're brave enough to ask ourselves, what is the opposition on the other side? Because we are pushing and they're pushing, and I think we can continue to do that for the rest of our lives. We won't ever find a solution that way. And when Jonathan was talking, I started thinking back what happened, what I did on how the safety and extend, where did it start, was it hard to go forward? And I started thinking about what happened to Italy with the thousands and thousands of folks to the point where they're telling them they went, hey, we can't go anymore, I'll do this by ourselves. And then, sorry, we don't have the funds to help either. And so Italy was like, what do we do? That's what I'm saying to people that we can say. So I think that's where people speak to you, that the word is coming ashore. And do we have the resources to save those people or help those people? And where does that go? And so when we fell from the absolute other side of the coin into that phase, I think that's what people are afraid of. And And so it's like, we had it from that way, like, how can we help those people get over that fear? And, you know, and work that way, as opposed to we need to let these people in, but how can we solutions or what's the reliables and that's all. So yeah, that's just a quick question and a Steve. Well, you asked about resources, but we've been clear on absolutely I think that that's come down that policy line, hasn't it? I think that come down that potential side of line, hasn't it? And I don't know which. I mean, I think exactly. Sorry.